Omensight is a game developed by Spearhead Games, and it's available on all major platforms. This will be a mostly spoiler-free review, although I will discuss the general idea behind the game's story as well as a basic introduction to the plot. Any major spoilers will be covered in a section near the end with a clear warning, which is also where I will discuss the ending of the game. So, let's get into my review of Omensight. If I had to describe my general thoughts on Omensight, I would say that it's a game with a serviceable but ultimately unremarkable combat system, and it has a very cool way to deliver its story with an ending that ultimately disappoints. The game is marketed as an action murder mystery, which was what made me interested in it. That description alone was enough to make me consider playing the game, but what really sets Omensight apart is its time travel mechanic. In Omensight, you play as the Harbinger, an outsider to the world sent to solve the murder of an important priestess, which will cause the apocalypse at the end of the day. As the Harbinger, you have access to many special abilities, but the most important one is that when an important character dies, you can create a connection with them, and go back in time to meet them at the beginning of the world's final day, before they died. This is the way the game chooses to tell its story. You begin the day with one of the characters and try to find out what they know about the murdered priestess, Vera, with the ultimate goal of figuring out who murdered her. When you learn an important piece of information, it becomes an Omensight, which is a memory you can transfer to the characters as a way to change their actions during the day. There are two major factions at war with each other, and there are characters that you visit on both sides, so oftentimes going with one character can lead you into a boss fight with another character that you've gone with earlier, and most of them intersect in interesting ways during the duration of the game. The gameplay loop is basically picking a character to be with for the day, giving them important information that you've learned through Omensights, and then traveling around the world with them in order to find new information, fighting enemies as you go. Speaking of enemies, the combat system is an important aspect of the game, since you spend a lot of time fighting and killing enemies on both sides of the war. Omensight is an action game with a system that is comparable to the Arkham series of games. As the Harbinger, you are capable of fighting many enemies at once, and most encounters have you bouncing around hitting enemies all over the place and using different moves. When you're about to be attacked, an exclamation point will appear above the enemy. A white one if the attack can be interrupted, and a red one if it can't and needs to be dodged. I'll start with the good things about Omensight's combat. One thing I will say is that it usually feels good to play, although there are definitely exceptions to that, especially later in the game. Some of the abilities the Harbinger has access to are actually pretty cool and help make combat more than just attacking and then dodging every couple seconds. There's also a move specific to each character that you can use depending on who you choose to follow at the beginning of the day, and all of them feel really well designed and useful. I appreciate that they at least tried to have enemies that required unique methods of approach other than just pressing the attack button, although I don't think they were entirely successful. The progression system of Omensight is another high point. It's a well-balanced system that introduces new moves as you level up and also upgrades your existing moves. You can also purchase stat upgrades that improve your health, damage, or reduces cooldowns on specific moves. It isn't game-changing, but there were noticeable differences when I upgraded the Harbinger. Although I think Omensight succeeds in having the combat be entertaining overall, there is a lot that could be improved, so let me talk about the elements that I wasn't a fan of. I have a problem with some of the moves you unlock, mainly that I didn't find a couple of them to be useful or very fun to use. This is a minor complaint for sure, but I think in an action game where you don't have that many options in combat, having two moves that aren't good at all can be an unfortunate detriment. There's one where you dash a certain distance away, and I never really found it useful in any situation while playing. The only major upgrade you can get for it makes it do a minuscule amount of damage to enemies if you happen to pass through them, but it still wasn't worth using. The other one is a basic ranged attack that could shoot a large projectile at an enemy. Although it did an okay amount of damage to one enemy, it kind of felt like a waste of time when the Harbinger's basic attack could rip through them so much faster. When it comes to enemy variety, I have to admit I'm torn. I don't think there are enough unique enemies, but I also understand that it's kind of hard to introduce that many variations when you're going through the same day over and over again. There is definitely a difficulty curve that increases every time you get a new Omensight and introduces new enemies, but it isn't particularly substantial and you end up fighting very similar enemies over and over again. The lack of variety would be a little bit more forgivable if the enemies were interesting, but the problem is most enemies, especially the ones introduced later in the game, just aren't that fun to fight. I would even say that some of them can be annoying, and I have two in mind. First is this big purple monster who basically just pounds the ground every time you try and attack. There isn't really much of a strategy to beat him. You can either slowly kill him one attack at a time by attacking and rolling away, or what I usually do is slow down time and use the attack that can one-shot any enemy. Either way, it's not particularly fun to me, and it's either time-consuming or takes no time at all. The other enemy is this dog, where every time you attack him once, he puts up a fire shield that as far as I can tell is unbreakable, and you have to wait a couple seconds before attacking again. It breaks up the flow of combat, and the strategy is basically to just wait until their shield goes down and attack again. Maybe it will depend on the person, but I personally found it very annoying. The game's camera can also sometimes be a detriment to the experience. It isn't controlled by the player, and there were definitely times where I wished I could have controlled it, because there would be an enemy just out of sight that I couldn't fully see, and it made a fight more annoying. Finally, I want to briefly mention the boss fights, because I don't think they're great. They range from being okay to a complete waste of time. The worst is when a boss is floating, because that means your only options for damage is jumping in the air and attacking, and the fight becomes incredibly uninteresting. You fight the same characters in boss fights multiple times, so the problem becomes compounded when you have to do it over and over again. I can only think of one boss fight that I genuinely enjoyed, which is not great considering the number of times you have to do them. Hopefully I don't come off as sounding like I hate the combat in this game, because I don't. It was good enough that I wasn't bored in the moments between big story reveals, but overall I wasn't incredibly impressed by it. Moving on from combat, the story of Omensight is really the reason I felt like it was worth playing. The Groundhog Day style of repeating the same day over and over again might have some minor negative gameplay implications, but it is a great tool for delivering an interesting story. Although I will note that it's hard to call Omensight a murder mystery game. You don't really solve much of anything, it's more like you figure out how to get a character to the right place and then they solve things for you. I wasn't too upset by this because I think the process of getting all the information and knowing where to go still requires the player to be paying attention and thinking about what to do next. Each character has their own seal that opens doors, and if you get them to open one in front of you, it will allow you to open any door with that seal for the rest of the game. This is usually the way you can open up new paths in an area you've already explored, and it can sometimes change the outcome of the day. Unfortunately, as you get farther into the game, finding the next clue often just means picking whether you want to kill a character or show them an Omensight. And almost every time the answer is to show them the Omensight. I can only think of one time where the answer was to allow a character to be killed. This is one of the biggest reasons I think the game fails as a mystery game, because the moments when the game does allow you to make a choice, the correct path is almost always exceedingly obvious. And even when it isn't, there are only ever two choices to make. But despite this, I still think the story is interesting, and it's the main reason I kept playing. A big reason for that is the characters in the game are all excellent. You have the characters on Quagsir's side, Emperor Indrik and General Draga, and the ones on the side of the Rodentian rebels, Radika the leader of the rebellion, as well as Ludimir, a bear that was extremely close to the murdered priestess. The Harbinger isn't interested in helping one side win the war, so you get to be on both sides depending on which character you choose to follow, and you can see how your actions change which side wins the battle. As the game progresses, you also realize that some of the characters are keeping secrets and are much deeper than they first appear. Most of the time, the repeating day mechanic made the characters more interesting, because it allowed you to see how they react in the same general events, but with different levels of information. However, I can think of one moment where the mechanic hampered its storytelling. One of the main characters is named Indrik, and I don't want to say anything specific, but it is very clear from the beginning of the game that Indrik is not a good person. Or bird, I guess. Have I mentioned that all the characters in this game are animals? Except for the Harbinger, who's just kind of a blue, featureless humanoid figure. Anyways, Indrik has done a lot of horrible stuff, and doesn't really show any regret. Until you happen to hit a moment in the game where he learns some important information from an Omensight. From that point on, for the rest of the day, Indrik is completely remorseful and regrets basically everything he's ever done, and it just doesn't feel earned. But I get why it was so hard for them, because Indrik is reset every time you start a new day, so they couldn't have him grow as a character over time. Even so, I kinda wish they wouldn't have bothered trying to redeem him, because there really just wasn't a good way for them to have done it. This isn't a problem with most of the characters because a lot of what you're discovering about them is stuff that has already happened in the past, and none of them are drastically changed by the end from who they were before. The characters all have different ways of dealing with the same problem, and I enjoyed seeing how each of them reacts to new information. For example, Draga is someone who tries to figure out the best solution to each problem and tries to avoid casualties as much as possible, while Ludimir is someone who doesn't hesitate to rush in and takes any risk to accomplish his goal. One thing that I found a little bit weird about the story is that the Harbinger is a silent protagonist. The only thing you can communicate are Omensight memories that you found, and everything else has to be figured out by the characters themselves. There are multiple points where someone comments about how the Harbinger never says anything and how they have to figure out what you want for themselves. I think I understand why the developers didn't want the Harbinger to talk, but it does make things a little bit weird. It's hard to pin down exactly why, but I think it's kind of strange that the last hope of preventing the apocalypse sent out by the Tree of Life is unable to communicate with the people around them except through flashbacks of other people's memories. But the thing is, if the Harbinger could talk, the mystery would be solved incredibly quickly. The Harbinger could just say something like, "Hey, I need your seal right now to open this important door," and skip all the parts of the game where you try and get a character to use their seal naturally so you can learn it. I'm not sure I would really consider this a criticism of the game, but it's something that I thought was worth bringing up. That's pretty much all I wanted to talk about without spoiling the ending. I pointed out some problems I had, but overall I think the game is worth playing, and the story kept me hooked for almost all 10 hours that it took me to finish my first playthrough. I said almost 10 hours because there is one part of the game that I haven't addressed yet, which is the ending. I can't say much about it without spoiling things, but I will say that I was not really a fan of it. So now let me get into a quick spoiler discussion about why that is. If you haven't played the game, please skip to the time on the screen now and only watch if you don't care about being spoiled. The ending of the game isn't about finding out who killed Vera. You actually figure out the answer a little bit before that. Vera was killed by the cult that is bringing about the apocalypse by summoning Vodin, a giant serpent that can destroy the world. Vera was actually helping the cult because she thought she could use Vodin to end the war between Picaria and Rodentia, but it backfired when they killed her after she stopped being useful. The actual ending of the game is about stopping Vodin from invading the world by sealing him away forever. You do this by invading the place where Vodin is currently imprisoned and defeating him once and for all in a typical boss battle. I talked earlier about how I didn't like Omensight's boss battles, and this one didn't exactly make up for the other lackluster boss fights. Vodin appears as a clone of the Harbinger to fight you, except he's purple instead of blue, which has some story implications explained later that make sense, but I found it incredibly uninteresting. Almost all of Vodin's moves come from other bosses, which makes him not really feel new, but you at least have more to do while fighting him than the other ones because they're all combined into one. Honestly, I just found the final fight to be anticlimactic. Vodin was substantially easier than some of the fights that came before him in my experience, and I felt disappointed when I beat him. Unfortunately, the disappointment didn't stop there, because after you beat the boss, the game has a final explanation of what happens now that the Harbinger has stopped the apocalypse. Since the Harbinger wasn't there to stop them, everything that you prevent during the time loops by interacting with the characters ends up happening. Radika sacrifices her soul to defeat and kill Draga, which causes Indrik to end the war, and the being that took over Radika rules the Redentians in the same horrible way that caused them to rebel against Indrik in the first place. Then, to top it all off, Ludimir becomes depressed and an alcoholic and is eventually killed. I don't want to spend too long talking about why I don't like this ending, because it seems like the developers didn't like the ending enough either and added more later, but I do want to quickly say why it disappointed me. There's nothing inherently wrong with downer endings. A well-done ending where things don't turn out happily ever after can be really engaging. I think the problem with this ending is that it takes away all the progress that you make during the game. The Harbinger is trying to stop the apocalypse, but in the process they fix a lot of problems for these characters. You stop all of the events that take place in the ending at some point during the game. It just gets reset the next day. It's frustrating to feel like all your work was for nothing. Although you stopped the apocalypse, you did it at the expense of all these characters that you felt attached to. And maybe that was the point, and it was supposed to be about how you can't save everyone, or some commentary about the cost of war. But if it was, it really just didn't land for me, and I ended up just wondering what the point of it all was. After this ending, I was quite annoyed, and I shut the game off as soon as the credits were over. But what I didn't know at the time was that there was another ending added. I played the definitive edition of Omensight on PC, and it turns out when they released the updated edition, they added a new ending. Maybe this was an acknowledgement that the other ending wasn't satisfactory, or just something they wanted to do and didn't have time when the game first released. I don't know for sure. In this ending, you get a new mission where you can go back to before Vera is killed and show her as well as Indrik everything that is going to happen if she helps bring back Voden. This convinces Vera that she shouldn't go through with her plan, and it also convinces her and Indrik to help you banish Voden once and for all, so he really can't come back. Showing Indrik this memory makes him immediately want to stop the war, so they end up recruiting Radika, Ludimir, and Draga to help you kill Voden. As a result, the Harbinger basically goes to the sword where Voden is imprisoned. It's kinda confusing, I know, and all 4 of the other characters protect the sword from being taken by his minions. You then kill Voden again in a fight that is very similar to the other one, so I don't really need to talk about it again. Finally, you imprison him once and for all, I guess. Then you get a nice happy ending where everyone gets what they want. Radika doesn't have to lead a rebellion anymore because Indrik ends the war, and Draga gets to retire. Ludimir gets to not be an alcoholic and lives a happy life and everyone wins. I'm rather conflicted about this ending. Although I like it better than the original, it still didn't really accomplish everything I was hoping it would. I'll start off with what I liked about it. First of all, I liked the fact that all the characters were at least somewhat involved in the finale this time, instead of being entirely absent like in the original ending. I like that the Harbinger's actions actually end up having meaning in this ending because the other characters see what was going to happen in their future and change their actions to avoid it. And I also enjoyed seeing these characters I like get good endings where everything isn't horrible for them. But I was still a little disappointed by aspects of this ending. First of all, the Harbinger solves all the problems by going back in time to before most of them happened. To me, this is a little bit less interesting than the Harbinger actually solving the problems in the present day. I don't really think the decision to have Vera survive was a great one. I certainly wanted a happy ending, but Vera dying was always a consequence of her actions, and I think it would have been more interesting if the characters, especially Ludimir, actually had to cope with her death instead of it just being removed entirely. I would have preferred if the Harbinger had actually been the one to help solve their problems in the final day that the rest of the game took place in, and then defeated Voden. I understand that would be a bit much to add for a definitive edition like this, so maybe it's not a realistic thing to want. Another thing I found disappointing is that the Voden fight wasn't really substantially different, and you basically just do the same thing again. Overall, I didn't mind this ending, although it just went from being pretty bad to being kind of unremarkable to me now. And that does it for my review of Omensight. I was honestly planning for this to be a short review, and it turned out a little longer than I anticipated, but I hope you enjoyed it. I would like to do a review on a game that has come out recently, but I can't promise that there will be consistent uploads from here on out. I'm sure that's obvious considering how long it's been since my last video. If you like what I had to say, please subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments if you played Omensight and if you agree or disagree with the things I said. And see you next time.